morning of August 9th, 1945. In Tokyo, the air is thick with desperation. The Supreme Council is deadlocked. Just hours ago, the Soviet Union, their last hope for a negotiated peace, declared war, pouring across the Manchurian border. And now, as the generals argue, a new report arrives, even more terrifying than the last. Another flash, another city gone. The clock is no longer ticking towards victory or defeat. It is ticking towards annihilation. The final decision must be made now. To understand how Japan arrived at this precipice, we must look past the battlefield and into the very mind of its leadership. For this was not just a war of steel and fire, but a war built upon a foundation of carefully constructed illusions. It began years earlier with a series of fundamental miscalculations about their enemy, assumptions so deeply held they became articles of faith. The entire war plan, from the first wave of aircraft at Pearl Harbor, was a gamble predicated on a flawed vision of America. The first pillar of this faith was a belief in American spiritual weakness. Japanese leaders, including the formidable Minister of War, General Korechika Anami, were convinced that the United States was a nation of merchants and comfort seekers, lacking the stomach for a prolonged, bloody conflict. They believed American morale was brittle, that a few sharp, devastating blows would shatter their will to fight and force them to the negotiating table. The second pillar was the tyranny of distance. The vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean was seen not as a challenge, but as an insurmountable barrier for American logistics. How could a nation mobilize and project power across thousands of miles of hostile water? To the Imperial General Staff, it seemed a logistical impossibility, a natural defense that would bleed the American war machine dry before it could ever truly threaten the homeland. The final and most crucial pillar was the concept of Yamato-damashii, the unique, indomitable spirit of the Japanese people. This was their ace, the spiritual force that they believed could triumph over any material disadvantage. General Umezu, chief of the Imperial General Staff, and Admiral Toyota, head of the Navy, saw the coming conflict not as a contest of production lines, but as a crucible of wills. In their minds, the superior fighting spirit of the Japanese soldier, forged in the warrior traditions of the samurai, would inevitably overcome America's quantitative superiority in tanks, ships, and planes. There were voices of caution, of course. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack itself, had spent time in America and understood its industrial power. He famously warned that he could run wild for 6 months or a year, but after that, he had no confidence whatsoever in the outcome. His warnings were a footnote in a grander, more intoxicating narrative of spiritual destiny. These three beliefs in American fragility, the Pacific barrier, and Japanese spirit were not just strategic assessments. They were a national ideology. They shaped every decision, informed every plan, and, most critically, blinded an entire generations of leaders to the cataclysmic reality they were about to unleash. This grand self-deception was a fortress, built to shield them from the inconvenient truths of industrial warfare. But on August 6th, and again on August 9th, a weapon born of a reality they refused to acknowledge did not simply knock on the fortress door. It vaporized the entire structure, leaving its architects standing dumbfounded in the rubble, forced at last to see the world not as they wished it to be, but as it truly was. The initial months of the war seemed to prove the High Command's assumptions correct. Victories cascaded across the Pacific, from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies. The Western powers seemed to crumble before the might of the emperor's forces. This early success was intoxicating. It was the validation they craved, a confirmation that spiritual strength was indeed superior to slumbering industrial might. Admiral Yamamoto's cautious timeline was remembered not as a warning, but as a prophecy of inevitable triumph. The fortress of their belief stood strong. Then came the Battle of Midway in June 1942. On paper, it was a disaster of unprecedented scale. 4 of the Imperial Navy's finest aircraft carriers, the very tip of Japan's spear, were sent to the bottom of the Pacific. It was a catastrophic blow that should have forced a fundamental reevaluation of the entire war. But inside the Imperial General Headquarters, the defeat was not processed as a strategic failure. It was reframed. It became a story of tragic misfortune, of a series of unlucky breaks. They focused on a single American dive bomber, finding a fatal gap in their defenses, on communication errors, on tactical blunders. It was anything but a sign that the enemy was more resilient, more resourceful, or more capable than they had imagined. The core assumption, that they were the superior fighting force, remained untouched, bandaged by excuses. The battle became a tragic anomaly, not a turning point. If Midway was a sharp, sudden crack in their worldview, Guadalcanal was a slow, grinding pressure that threatened to shatter it entirely. Beginning in August 1942, this brutal campaign in the Solomon Islands directly assaulted their foundational beliefs. The Americans did not break. They clung to that fetid island with ferocious tenacity, absorbing horrific casualties and fighting on. The logistical barrier of the Pacific, once thought to be Japan's greatest ally, was systematically conquered by the United States Navy's Seabees and supply convoys. American industry was reaching across the ocean, projecting power in a way Tokyo had deemed impossible. Yet again, the leadership refused to see the writing on the wall. The loss of Guadalcanal was attributed not to American strength, but to a failure to properly support their own troops. The narrative shifted. They were not defeated by a superior enemy, but let down by their own logistical shortcomings. The soldiers who died of starvation and disease were martyrs to a tactical oversight, not victims of a fundamentally flawed national strategy. All the while, a different kind of evidence was accumulating, far from the blood-soaked beaches. In quiet back offices in Tokyo, intelligence officers like Colonel Hideaki Sato were compiling reports that painted a terrifying picture. These reports didn't speak of battles, but of factories. They contained numbers that seemed like fantasy. America was building over 40 aircraft carriers. They were producing nearly 88,000 tanks. Their factories were churning out hundreds of thousands of aircraft. To the men on the Supreme Council, these figures were not intelligence. They were absurdities. They were viewed as crude, transparent propaganda, designed to intimidate and demoralize. The numbers were so vast, so far beyond Japan's own industrial capacity, that they could not be reconciled with reality. To believe them would be to admit the war was lost before it had even begun. And so, the reports were dismissed. The messengers were ignored. The fortress of self-deception held, its walls now papered over with denial. They chose to believe in the myth of their own supremacy, because the alternative was simply too terrifying to contemplate. As the war ground on, the gap between Japan's foundational beliefs and the grim reality on the battlefield grew into a chasm. The island-hopping campaign of the United States was a relentless drumbeat of defeat, each new landing a fresh testament to America's overwhelming material power. Iwo Jima and Okinawa were not battles, they were meat grinders, turning the myth of Japanese spiritual superiority into ash. The famed Yamato-damashii was met with a terrifying new force: industrial-scale attrition. For every Japanese soldier who fought with suicidal bravery, America could bring 10 times the weight in artillery shells, bombs, and napalm. Yet even these horrific bloodbaths failed to shatter the High Command's core delusions. Instead, they became twisted symbols of honor. The staggering casualty rates were held up as proof of Japanese fighting spirit. Propaganda back home spun tales of heroic sacrifice, transforming strategic calamities into spiritual victories. The narrative became one of noble resistance against a brutish, materialistic foe. The loss of territory was a temporary setback. The spirit demonstrated in its defense was an eternal triumph. While General Anami and his cohorts clung to these romantic notions of warfare, a different kind of war was being waged in secret across the deserts and laboratories of America. It was a war of intellect, of science, and of industry on a scale the world had never seen. The Manhattan Project was more than just a weapons program. It was the ultimate expression of the very power Japan had so profoundly misunderstood. It brought together over 100,000 of the brightest minds, backed by a budget of $2 billion, an amount equivalent to Japan's entire annual military expenditure. Sprawling, secret cities like Oak Ridge and Hanford rose from nothing, dedicated to a single, esoteric purpose: splitting the atom. This colossal undertaking represented the true nature of American strength. It wasn't just about building more tanks or ships. It was about the ability to mobilize intellectual and industrial resources on a continental scale to organize a vast, complex, and unprecedented scientific enterprise. It was the product of a system that encouraged innovation, a democratic society that could unite its universities, corporations, and government in pursuit of a single goal. To the Japanese High Command, this dimension of warfare was entirely invisible. They were playing checkers while their opponent was playing three-dimensional chess. Their understanding of power was rooted in territory, honor, and the fighting spirit of the individual soldier. They could not conceive of a power that grew not from the barrel of a gun, but from a university laboratory and a factory assembly line. By the summer of 1945, the conventional war was already lost. American B-29 bombers flew with impunity over Japan, firebombing its cities into cinders. The Imperial Navy was at the bottom of the sea. The Army was a shadow of its former self, preparing for a final, suicidal defense of the homeland with bamboo spears and antiquated rifles. Yet the Supreme Council remained paralyzed, trapped within the fortress of their own making. They were still debating terms, still hoping for a negotiated peace, still believing that their unbreakable spirit could force a more favorable outcome. They were arguing about the ghosts of a war that had ended long ago, oblivious to the new reality that was about to be unleashed. The stage was set for the final, brutal lesson. A lesson that would not be delivered by an army or a fleet, but by 3 lone aircraft appearing in the skies over a secondary industrial city. On the morning of August 6, 1945, the first report reached Tokyo from Hiroshima. It was fragmented, confusing, and utterly unbelievable. Communications with the entire city had ceased. The telephone lines were dead. The telegraph was silent. Initial reports from a pilot who had flown over the area spoke of a massive, roiling cloud of smoke and dust, and of a city that had simply vanished. In the Imperial General Headquarters, the news was met with skepticism and disbelief. The destruction of an entire city was a process, something that took hundreds of bombers and thousands of tons of ordnance over many hours. The idea that it could happen in an instant was a physical impossibility, according to their understanding of warfare. The staff officers theorized it must have been a freak accident. Perhaps a massive munitions depot had exploded. Some dismissed it as hysterical exaggeration. But the truth was, no frame of reference existed for what had just occurred. A single weapon, delivered by just 3 B-29 superfortresses, had achieved a result that defied all military logic. The atomic bomb did not just destroy a city, it destroyed the fundamental grammar of war as they knew it. As more information trickled in over the next day, a horrifying picture began to form. Eyewitness accounts spoke of a single, blinding flash of light, of a searing heat that melted stone, of a wind that flattened buildings for miles. The scale of the devastation was so absolute, it began to short-circuit the High Command's mechanisms of denial. This wasn't a tactical setback that could be explained away by bad luck. It wasn't a defeat that could be spun into a tale of spiritual resistance. This was something different. It was a technological leap so profound that it rendered their entire military philosophy obsolete in a single moment. Yamato-damashii, the spirit they had wagered their empire on, could not stand against the power of a star unleashed on Earth. For the first time, the dismissed intelligence reports from Colonel Sato and others started to look less like propaganda and more like prophecy. The fantastic numbers, the 88,000 tanks, the 41 aircraft carriers, suddenly seemed plausible. If America could create a weapon like this, a weapon that harnessed the fundamental forces of the universe, what else were they capable of? The bomb was the ultimate proof of the industrial and scientific reality they had so arrogantly ignored. It was the physical manifestation of the Manhattan Project, of the secret cities and the colossal budget. They had believed they were fighting a nation of soft-willed merchants. They now faced the horrifying realization that they had been fighting a nation of scientists and engineers who had weaponized physics itself. The psychological impact was immense. General Anami and the hardliners, who had been advocating for a final suicidal battle on the beaches of Japan, were momentarily stunned into silence. Their strategy relied on inflicting such heavy casualties on an American invasion force that Washington's will to fight would break. But the atomic bomb presented a terrifying new equation. The enemy no longer needed to invade. They could now stand off at 30,000 feet and methodically erase Japan, city by city, without risking a single soldier on the ground. The fortress of self-deception, which had withstood Midway, Guadalcanal, and Okinawa, was finally breached. A crack of terrifying light had appeared in its walls, illuminating the ruinous state of their position. Yet even then, the old ways of thinking died hard. The will to resist, ingrained for generations, flickered on. Perhaps it was a bluff. Perhaps the Americans only had one such bomb. The debate raged, fueled by desperation and a deep-seated refusal to accept the totality of their defeat. They needed one final push to shove them over the edge of surrender. It would arrive just 3 days later. The final blows fell on August 9th, a day that would forever seal the fate of Imperial Japan. In the pre-dawn hours, a message arrived that extinguished the last flicker of hope for a negotiated settlement. The Soviet Union, the neutral power that Tokyo had been desperately courting to mediate a peace, had declared war. A massive Red Army force, over 1 million strong, stormed across the border into Manchuria, shattering the vaunted Kwantung Army. For months, Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki and Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo had clung to the belief that Soviet neutrality could be their diplomatic escape hatch. It was their final strategic gambit, a way to end the war without the humiliation of unconditional surrender. That hope was now annihilated. They were utterly, irrevocably alone, encircled by enemies. The news of the Soviet invasion sent a shockwave through the Supreme Council, which had convened for an emergency session. The military hardliners were cornered, their strategic chessboard wiped clean. Yet, even as they absorbed this devastating news, another report began to filter in, this one from the southern part of the country. It was fragmentary, chaotic, but chillingly familiar. Another flash of light, another city gone. This time, it was Nagasaki. The second atomic bomb was more than just another attack. It was a psychological death blow. It answered the desperate question that had haunted the leadership since Hiroshima. Was the first bomb a singular, a miraculous fluke? Nagasaki provided the terrifying answer. It was not a fluke. The Americans had more. This was not a weapon. It was a production line. The ability to systematically erase Japan's cities was now a proven capability. This 1-2 punch, the Soviet invasion, and the bombing of Nagasaki finally shattered the last remnants of the will to resist. The war was no longer a contest of spirit or tactics. It was a race against extinction. The choice was no longer between victory and defeat, but between surrender and the complete annihilation of the Japanese people and their culture. Inside the imperial palace, the 6 members of the Supreme Council remained deadlocked. General Anami, General Umezu, and Admiral Toyota, prisoners of the ideology they had championed for so long, still refused to accept unconditional surrender. They argued for one final, honorable battle on home soil. On the other side, Prime Minister Suzuki, Foreign Minister Togo, and the Navy Minister argued that the time for such notions was over. The nation itself was at stake. The stalemate was absolute. In an unprecedented move, Prime Minister Suzuki took the decision to the one man who could break the deadlock, Emperor Hirohito. In a sweltering underground bunker, the emperor listened to the arguments of his divided council. He heard the military's call for a final, glorious battle, and he heard the civilian government's plea for survival. Then, in a quiet, measured voice, he spoke. He stated that continuing the war could only result in the destruction of the nation. Referencing the new and most cruel bomb, he declared that the time had come to bear the unbearable. It was over. The decision, coming from the divine authority of the throne, was final. The fortress of self-deception, built over decades of myth and willful ignorance, had finally crumbled to dust. The men who had led their nation into a catastrophic war based on a fantasy were now forced, by the irrefutable logic of nuclear fire and geopolitical reality, to confront the truth. The surrender was not just a military capitulation. It was an intellectual one. It was the admission of a profound, systemic, and ultimately fatal misunderstanding of their enemy. The formal surrender ceremony took place on September 2, 1945, aboard the imposing steel deck of the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. As the Japanese delegation, led by a somber Foreign Minister Togo, signed the instrument of surrender, They were surrounded by the very manifestation of the power they had so fatally misjudged. An armada of Allied warships filled the bay, a seemingly endless forest of gray hulls and gun barrels, while hundreds of American aircraft roared overhead in a final, thunderous display of air supremacy. This was not just a ceremony. It was the final, irrefutable lesson in the reality of American industrial might. In the months and years that followed, as Japan transitioned from a militaristic empire to a pacifist democracy under American occupation, its former leaders were forced into a painful period of introspection. Stripped of their authority and the propaganda that had sustained their worldview, they finally began to grasp the true scale of their miscalculation. It became clear that they had not just lost a war. They had fought a different war entirely from the one their enemy was waging. They had staked everything on the decisive battle, the single glorious engagement that would break the enemy's spirit. America, in contrast, had waged a war of logistics, of science, of overwhelming and relentless production. They finally understood that America had never even been fighting at its full capacity. The 88,000 tanks and 41 carriers were not propaganda. They were merely what was required for victory. Had the war continued, the numbers would have grown even larger. They had prided themselves on their own martial spirit while dismissing the American system as decadent and weak. Now they saw that America's strength was its system, its democratic ideals, its free market capitalism, its culture of innovation. These were not weaknesses. They were the very engines that had fueled the Manhattan Project, that had built the B-29 bombers, and that had put an unstoppable fleet in their waters. General Anami, unable to reconcile his code of honor with the humiliation of surrender, chose ritual suicide on the day the Emperor's broadcast was to be aired. Others, like Admiral Toyota, would later admit in interrogations that they had been fighting an enemy they did not understand. They had seen the individual American soldier and judged him inferior to their own. They had failed to see the colossal industrial and scientific civilization that stood behind that soldier, arming him, feeding him, and endlessly reinforcing him. The story of Japan's awakening to American power is a cautionary tale about the dangers of national self-deception. It demonstrates how a powerful, intelligent, and capable nation can lead itself to ruin by allowing mythology to triumph over reality. They built a fortress of belief to shield themselves from uncomfortable truths, and in the end, that fortress became their tomb. The atomic bombs were the final shattering blows, but the war was truly lost years before, in the minds of leaders who chose to believe in a comforting fantasy, rather than confront a terrifying but undeniable truth.